Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wassalam ala rasulillah amma ba'd. In this session, we want to discuss a point that is essential to the understanding of the Imams of Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah. For some time now, within the discourse of Muslims in America, among some of its leadership, there has been a debate regarding the role of the muhaddith in conveying the deen. Recently, I reviewed an old argument that was put out into the public sphere, which called upon a number of scenarios to illustrate the point that there's a difference between the faqih and the muhaddith. There's a difference between the scholar of fiqh and the scholar of hadith. And in that there's some truth, but in a sense that fiqh is a discipline and hadith sciences is another discipline. But that's not what the speaker was getting at. Yes, we know that the sciences of Islam are differentiated by their contents and their principles. The principles that they use to do their research and the contents of focus. And that's a discussion in and of itself. Right? There's some books out there that will delineate each subject of study or each science within the tradition and outline what are the main issues that are researched in a particular science and what are the principles that that science engages and utilizes and employs in order to undertake its research. But what we want to get at here is this issue of differentiating between the faqih and the muhaddith, between the scholar of fiqh and the scholar of hadith. When we look at Imam Malik rahimahullah, we see an example early on in the time of Tabi'in of a person who's a faqih and a muhaddith at the same time. And we know that the Hanafis, even to this day, right? The Hanafis in India and Pakistan, that they have an argument that Abu Hanifa was a muhaddith. He related hadith, but what was dominant in him was fiqh. And we know that Imam Shafi rahimahullah, he was a scholar of hadith and a scholar of fiqh. And we know that Imam Ahmed rahimahullah was a scholar of hadith and a scholar of fiqh. And we know that Imam Ahmed became known for relating hadith, and some of the scholars, they had excluded Imam Ahmed from the circle of the people of fiqh and included him within the circle of the people of hadith. And there are a number of reasons for this historically. One is that his madhab was not dominant. Another was other historical circumstances of conflict which arose between the different madhahib and so on and so forth. There's a number of reasons why Imam Ahmed rahimahullah's madhab was not listed or not counted as a madhab of fiqh. Some being prejudice and some being just geographical issues and so on and so forth, out of the reasons that could explain that reality. And we see even some of the scholars today in Al-Azhar will mention the four madhabs and then exclude the madhab of Imam Ahmed rahimahullah. And we know that the Hanbali madhab is not taught in dominance as the other schools are taught. But there are Hanbali scholars that are present there in Al-Azhar that teach, like Sheikh Muhammad Saeed, who teaches in the masjid at the moment, and Sheikh Abdul Hakim, who's one of the ulama in the Qira'at, who teaches. We know that he's Hanbali and so on and so forth. But the point at hand is this, that early on the scholars of fiqh and hadith were one. But what dominated was a certain inclination to a certain approach. So we find that there was no separation between the scholar of fiqh and the scholar of hadith and so on and so forth. This is a later date reality that manifests itself, especially when the scholars of aqidah begin to delve into a philosophical approach to aqidah. Then we find that the scholars of hadith, some of them just focus on narrating hadith. But the great scholars of hadith, that was not their focus. The great scholars of hadith focus on not only investigating the chain of transmission, not only narrating and investigating the chain of transmission, but also critiquing the chain of transmission, and also critiquing the text of the hadith itself, and also deriving fiqh from the hadith. So we find many a great scholar that's a muhaddith and a scholar of hadith at the same time, even among the later day scholars, such as Hafiz Abdul Bar from the Maliki madhab, such as Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, such as Mullah Ali Qari from the Hanafi madhab. Ibn Daqiq al-Eid was a master of the Maliki and the Shafi'i. We find so many ulama. Imam Qutl al-Bugha from the Hanafis, who studied with Hafiz bin Hajar, was a scholar of hadith and a scholar of fiqh. Hafiz bin Hajar himself was a scholar of hadith and a scholar of fiqh. And he was a Hafiz for the sake of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. We have to read our tradition in a balanced way and not get caught up in this concept of reading the history of the ulama in a way which is biased. We have to look honestly. Bukhari, rahmatullahi alayhi, was a scholar of hadith and a scholar of fiqh, and Bukhari's text itself is considered a text for the fuqaha because of the way that it's structured. Now, there are some who don't agree with the opinions of Bukhari, but that doesn't mean that Bukhari was not a scholar of fiqh. That doesn't mean that Bukhari wasn't a faqih. So, to use the argument that there's a difference between the scholar of fiqh or the faqih and the muhaddith without substantiating these positions very well, that there's a group that's called the muhaddithun and a group that's called the fuqaha, and there's no overlap between them. We need to furnish proofs in order for that argument to be even considered an argument. Other than that, it's just a claim. But what we find historically is when we look at the biographies of the ulama, of the scholars, we find that there's a combination of sciences. So we find that the scholar of fiqh is a muhaddith, the scholar of hadith is a faqih. But there is a trend among later day scholars to separate between these sciences and to focus. And this is what's called in the history of fiqh the age of taqlid. So we find there is a trend of scholars that differentiate between the subjects, and many of them are weak in hadith. And they begin to look at the scholars of hadith as being people that just narrate hadith without much understanding. And there is a strain among the scholars of a hadith of this type of person who just narrates hadith without much depth and comprehension of the text itself. But that is not representative of the reality of the imams of ijtihad, whether it be Imam al-Bayhaqi, rahmatullahi alayhi, Imam al-Dhahabi, rahmatullahi alayhi, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahmatullahi alayh, or Zu'ayli, the scholar who composed Nasr Raya, who, which is a great book of fiqh and hadith that is very important not only in the Hanafi madhab but in the sciences of hadith overall because of his methodology in researching hadith. So we want to layer our position. Say yes, in some cases we find that there's a difference between the scholar of fiqh and the scholar of hadith, but in other cases we find great imams which combine the sciences. And most of them were scholars of hadith that were fuqaha, that were dominant in fiqh. And sometimes we find scholars of fiqh who have an inclination towards hadith, and sometimes we find scholars in usul that are scholars of hadith as well, like Imam al-Baji, rahmatullahi alayhi. And an example of a scholar of hadith who's a scholar of fiqh is like Imam al-Aini, Badr al-Din al-Aini, rahmatullahi alayhi. So we want to be careful that we don't give a bias reading of the tradition of Islam because we want to support a position in the current platform of da'wah in which there's various groups which compete with one another over interpreting not only the text but also the history of Islam. So what we find historically then is that many of the scholars of hadith had great insight into fiqh. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.